Welcome back to the No Gray Areas podcast, where I have the honor to be joined by a longtime friend and mentor, Ben Homan. Our interview together includes us sharing personal stories, exploring God's love in ordinary moments of life, and offering hope amidst the chaos of decision-making. Let's jump in. Ben Homan, welcome to the No Gray Areas podcast. Man, this is my pleasure having you on today. We were just talking before we turned on the mics and the camera that we've known each other for almost 20 years now.
That's right.
Back in 2005, we met, and you were running an organization that was a great organization, and I wanted so badly to work there. And I ended up coming there in 2006 and worked with you I was there for about 5 years. But what we want to do today, Ben, is I want to unpack your thoughts on the power and complexity of human choice. I want to unpack your thoughts on how a lot of humanity today in our world today and throughout human history actually don't have the level of choice that we may have, and just because of where we grew up and the places you've worked, that's something you've really seen firsthand and something that's very, very close and dear to your heart. I know that. But just for our audience to get to know you a little bit, let's just back up. Give us a little bit of your bio, like where you've worked, the organizations you've led, and why you led those organizations.
Sure, and it's actually very interesting to use the element of choice to be able to think through some of those steps, because choice certainly was involved. Some choices by other people and some of my own choices. And it goes back to the family of origin, a non-Christian family. And you know, my parents were nominally exposed to Christianity growing up, and they chose not to engage with Christianity as adults in raising children. And we may have attended church once every other year. It might have been an Easter here, there, but it really was not a relevant thing.
Yeah.
More relevant, and actually in my household, was horoscope. My mom would stretch out under the kitchen table some huge newsprint paper, and I'm not sure what she did in terms of architecting or sketching out the sky, revolving around when I was born. And I have no specific cognizance of her conclusions, but that was the household. And
so instead of the Bible, it was more the horoscope that was guiding and directing some of the family decision-making.
Exactly. It's a longer story. We may not have time for it, but I ended up hearing the gospel at a church. And so my choice, teenage rebellion, was to go towards the church, and it freaked my parents out.
It's so funny that you said that. So you were rebelling by going to church.
But yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And they were like, okay, you want to go not just on Sunday morning, you want to go Sunday night, you want to go to youth group on Wednesday. What is happening?
Yeah.
And they were scratching their heads.
They thought you were maybe in a cult or something.
They were
feel
worried.
like that to them?
They were worried about brainwashing. This was the 1970s, and so on the cover of Newsweek and Time magazine was the Jesus movement, and it was not well understood, and it was feared by many people in mainstream society. So that was the context. And then, one foot after the other, I had the opportunity, got a scholarship to go to a Christian school, and I planned to go into the pastorate. And that really freaked my folks out.
I imagine.
And so we reached a compromise. And so I switched my major from Christian education to communication. In the back of my mind, it was like, well, I'm going to learn how to preach.
Yeah.
But I ended up never being a pastor. I had a couple of near misses going to a seminary, but I ended up eventually working at a seminary as a layperson for almost 13 years. And I had a front row seat to the grace of God coming into people's lives, a discovery, a deepening of grace. And that probably was the thing that propelled me, what the New Testament calls the ministry of reconciliation, that God is working a way to bring us to himself.
Yeah.
And that to me was transformative, and I wanted to do whatever I could. And there were opportunities to go overseas and other things.
But let me just jump in really quick, Ben, and just tell our audience, this is one of the things that I've loved about you from the time I first met you almost 20 years ago. Grace, reconciliation has been a theme that I've consistently heard you speak of. Like it is embedded deep within your soul, as it should be, because it's the story, right? It's the narrative of the Bible that we moved away from him. He didn't move away from us. And then he's done everything to reconcile that relationship. But I've heard
Exactly.
I mean, I don't think I've ever heard you, you used to do, when I was there, you would do the presidential chapels once a month, I think it was, when I was at Food for the Hungry working. But I don't think I ever heard you speak where somewhere in there you didn't bring up this idea of reconciliation.
Well, in my view, you go into the scriptures, you plop into whatever book or story or narrative, and you want to ask yourself, at least the question I asked myself is, where are we in redemptive history? What is God doing here that's connected to his overarching story, the story of redemption? And I have a colleague of mine in my current ministry who's written a huge, magnificent tome called The Mission of God, Christopher J.H. Wright. And he does—
I've read it. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's an amazing book, and it's dense reading.
Yes, it is.
But it weaves together this notion of God on a mission. And that mission is coming after you, Pat, and me, Ben, and all the listeners. God's on a mission to come after us. And you can look at Scripture that way, open up whatever book of the Bible, and there's part of that story.
And I love that you say that, because it is true. Anywhere in the Bible you open up and you're going to find that. The very beginning of the narrative, that's the story, right? Where there's this perfect place that he creates. There's no sin. But once that enters in the world, what happens? God moves toward them.
Yes.
And they're hiding from him, but he moves toward them.
Yes.
And that's that reconciliation. And so that's been something that was deeply, like, you're going back to your story then. You were at 13 years, you were part of the seminary, and you're watching this story played out. You're watching all these individual human lives being transformed because of this reconciliation between God and people.
That's right. And then, a colleague in the theological education world approached me as I was, finishing one of my years at the seminary, and he said, there's a leadership transition going on at Food for the Hungry, and you ought to throw your hat in the ring. And I thought, ha, 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 there's no way that the board of directors of this very large humanitarian organization is going to turn to then a 40-year-old math-challenged fellow like me. And so I remember interviewing and telling the board of directors, look, I'll go talk with people for free, but you got to pay me to do budgets because I break a sweat to do numbers.
Yeah.
And I was just transparent about my mathematical failings. And their reaction was, we're not hiring a mathematician.
Yeah, we can get someone to do math.
We can hire the finance people, but we have an organization that wants to be on a mission. We want to have biblical fidelity and alignment in all that we do. And so they took a chance on this 40-year-old bloke like me, and had a 10-year ride with Food for the Hungry. And along the way, Pat, I learned that organizational improvement was one of the tools that the Lord had entrusted to me, and that's also a longer story. And so I had an opportunity to be a part of that with the seminary I was a part of, with Food for the Hungry. And then along came Langham Partnership. That's who I serve with now, Langham Partnership.
And you've been there how long?
This is my 14th year.
14th year. I did not realize. You've been there longer than you were at Food for the Hungry.
Exactly.
Didn't realize that.
Yeah. Time marches on.
As we get older, time goes really fast,
really
doesn't
does.
it? That's unfortunate for all you young people. Just know that's coming.
So they were in a precarious place. They were doing such good work, but they were in a precarious place financially. And in real estate terms, I thought, this is a fixer-upper. I want to be a part of fixing and bringing to organizational health and financial health this excellent ministry. And so it's been a great experience. I work with amazing people.
So what's interesting, you bring up the organizational improvement, and I definitely see that in you, that's something that God instilled in you, and that's not easy. That's a heavy load to carry. I know when you go into an organization and you have to change things and bring whatever change it needs to improve it, that takes some years off your life, doesn't it?
Well, it's intense, but you have to break it into parts.
Mm-hmm.
And so the image I like to use, I stole it from somewhere, is the image of a frog wanting to cross to the other side of the pond.
Mm-hmm.
And the frog cannot reach the other side of the pond in one leap,
Mm-hmm.
but he can go from one lily pad to the next.
Mm-hmm.
And so in organizational change, you need to figure out, have a sense of what does that distant shore look like?
Yeah.
But what are the intermediate places you need to go to in order to get to the other side?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you need to think through a sequence of, which lily pad first and which lily pad second. And so that does take the stress off. Again, a phrase I am lifting from somewhere I've read, and that is that we sometimes overestimate what we can do in 1 year and underestimate what we do in 10.
Yeah.
And so with persistence, going after it year after year, wonderful things can happen. And if anybody's out there listening and they're early in their career or early in a particular job, I usually say, hey, the first 18 months really hurts because you've been one time around the track, one lap, and you've just started that second lap, and everything that you're experiencing is new or fresh, and that is stressful. But after you stay in that cycle year after year and you start learning the cycle and mastering the cycle, then you get to see some fun things happen.
Yeah. I love what you said, that point you brought up about overestimating what we can do in a year and underestimating what we can do in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
Because I think, again, for all of our listeners, because some of our listeners may be in leadership or management positions where they are trying to bring organizational change, and some may not be in those positions, but all of us are in play with our individual lives.
Yes.
Where that is true of our life too, that, implementing some daily time with God, getting in His Word, praying, meditating. What that's going to do for us a month or a year from now, we might overestimate. But you do that consistently for 5-10 years, we probably can't even imagine. Same thing with eating healthy or working out or any of the habits, good habits that we may want to bring into our life. So I think that's such an important thing that you bring up, Ben. Well, let me go back. This is something that has been kind of the core of your heart since I've known you. This redemptive story, that God trying to heal the broken relationship between Him and us as humanity. But also you've had a deep heart and longing for the least, last, and lost, we may say.
Right.
Where did that come from?
Well, I think it comes from the heart of God, and it goes back to my story. I grew up in Southern California, non-Christian family. Nobody knew who we were. We were, in a sense, nobodies. And I heard the gospel, and my reaction was, me? You're coming after me? God, you love me, you see me? And it was hard to get my arms around. It still is hard to get my arms around it. But He came after me. So I was a awkward 13-year-old, and God came after this awkward 13-year-old. And so that's that story of God seeing me in this family that was not following after Him, to me was the paradigm that I have felt has carried me into the humanitarian work, where you go into a context to the least and the lost, the people who sometimes are simply statistics and not real people with real pain. Or they're not in our headlines. They're not on our news feed. And yet God sees them and he wants us to see them in their humanity, their dignity, the fact that they bear the image of the Most High God.
Mhm.
And regardless of the context, regardless of what position that they're in, they have incredible value.
Yeah, inherent value. Yeah.
And so I think it comes back to that. I have a friend of mine who is an amazing leader in India. He grew up in the Rajasthan province. And the way he phrases it is, I want to give the best to the least.
Mm. I want to give the best to the least.
And to me, that frames it. And when we think about the value of what the gospel is, that's exactly what it is. It's
Yeah.
giving the best to the least.
Yeah. And I hear you saying that's your story. As a 13-year-old in Southern California, no one knows who Ben Homan is.
That's right.
And we talk about the globe. I mean, who's Ben Homan? And yet God sees you. And I love that you use those words, by the way, because one of my favorite names for God, El Rohi, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but the Hebrew name, one of the many different descriptors of who God is the God who sees, right? So I love that you use that phrase, that God saw you. And that's one of the things that's so incredible is any of our listeners, that's the message, and that's what you're saying. That's the message of the
Right.
gospel is God sees you in your brokenness,
Right.
in your hurt, in your lostness, in your worst day. He sees you and he loves you.
Mm-hmm.
And his whole goal is to reconcile the relationship with you. And so, Ben, that was something. In fact, you're also, by the way, I don't know if you know this, but I'll give you credit for it. I did a lot of public speaking in the last 20, 30 years. I never spoke more on any passage than I did on Micah 6:8. And that's your fault, my friend.
Mm-hmm.
That is your fault. You made me fall in love with that verse. He has showed you, oh man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, not requests, not recommends, but what the Lord requires of you to do justice, to love mercy, and walk humbly with our God.
Right. It's a
That was
beautiful summary of the message of redemption.
Yeah, and when I first arrived in 2005, started working at Food for the Hungry, that was kind of the theme that we were talking about, and something that you would speak to every time you got up. And I fell in love with it because I do see that. That's the message of God to us, and that's our message to the world. But to
Right.
do justice and to unpack that is complex and messy, isn't it?
It is. And I love the prophet Micah as well. And this is part of the story of that book, is that, first of all, when in the words of Scripture, there's very little autobiographical information that Micah shares with the audience. But we do know that he was Micah of Moresheth. And the people who've studied the battles and the conflicts in the Holy Land realize that particular village that he was at was a strategic high place for armies to seize as they invaded Israel. And so the Bible expositors surmise that Micah was probably an eyewitness to traumatic battles, gruesome, difficult battles in his town. And so here, in modern terms, he probably had post-traumatic syndrome, post-traumatic stress. And so he comes as this messenger, and the early chapters of the book of Micah are sometimes incredibly graphic in terms of not only the indictment that he has against both the political and religious leaders, people inside of government, people outside of government, people inside the religious matrix and people outside. And he sees the people that have been left out, and he speaks up. And then, especially in the first 3 chapters, but then it continues, and there is a shift in the 4th chapter of Micah where it talks about the mountain of God and how people from all over the world are streaming to the mountain of God. And as I was studying this years ago, and an excellent commentator that helped me with this, we all know gravity, Water does not flow uphill.
Yeah.
Water flows down.
Yep.
But the image in chapter 4 of Micah is the peoples of the earth flowing to the mountain against gravity.
Against gravity.
Against
odds.
Against odds. And so it's just this beautiful picture of God's magnificence and power and his magnetic, incredible intervention in the life of humanity to call people not from one nation or two nations or three nations, but all nations are streaming to the mountain of God. It's pretty exciting.
Oh, it is. You're making me fall in love with the Micah book. I need to go back and reread it again because it is, like you're saying, it's just an indictment against political leaders and religious leaders. And he's even telling the religious community, right? Like, you're doing a lot of these things like praying and tithing and fasting, and those are all good things, but you're missing what's really important, which is kind of the culmination of where he gets in Micah 6:8, right?
Exactly.
Where he's saying, what does it really mean? Like fasting, tithing, praying, those are all important things, but what does God really care about? Doing justice, loving mercy, walking humbly.
Exactly. And the political and religious leaders were watching land and property being taken away from people who had no standing or ability to speak and defend themselves.
Yeah. And
so there's an interesting way to look at some of these passages in Micah about land rights and property rights and ownership, and the fact that many of these leaders remained silent in the face of this injustice. And so, yes, it crescendos in Micah 6:8.
Yeah.
What does he require of us? To
silence in the face of injustice. That's a powerful statement. I circle back though, and I like this conversation because it's what you said when I asked you why do you care so deeply about the least, last, and lost. I've known Ben Homan for 20 years, and I've seen that with you, and I liked your answer. It really comes from the heart of God. As you've gotten to know God, how can you not? And I think that's true of all of us. If we're really getting to know the God of this universe, as we draw closer to him and get to know him better, I don't think it's possible at some point where our heart doesn't start shifting to care deeply for the least, last, and lost. Why? Because God does.
It's all over the scripture. You look at the disciples. They were a motley crew. If you were going to try to select the movers and shakers to change the world, no way.
Yeah.
Not one of them would qualify. And so God went after the unlikely. And then you look at the genealogies in the book of Matthew and the book of Luke, and peppered in those genealogies are unlikely people that God brought into the lineage of Jesus. And it is all over the scriptures that God goes after the unlikely.
Yeah, he does. And the unlikely, I think one of the ways that we can define that is those people that can't really do anything for you, right? Like they can't, again, in our world, a lot of times it's the kiss up and kick down culture, right? Like we're gonna try to get ahead, and that's a culture it's always been around. It's not just the American culture, but it could be anywhere. But what's so crazy is when we care about what God cares about, you start caring about the people that really can't do anything for you in a sense, right?
Right.
There's no reason to kiss up to them because they're maybe at a lowly place. There's no way to try to kick them down. They're already down. So it's caring deeply for those that really can't do anything for us, if you will.
Precisely.
Yeah. Yeah. But then what we find out is they actually do a lot for us.
We get blessed in ways that we, it's hard to put it into words, but I can think of story after story of, just the blessing of how people grow and bless and thank, and it can be a very beautiful thing.
Can I ask you to share one of those stories? Because let me just set it up this way.
Hey, we hope you've enjoyed this episode so far. Be sure to like and subscribe to not miss a future podcast. Okay, let's get back to the episode.
Can I ask you to share one of those stories? Because let me just set it up this way. We were talking before, you're probably the most traveled person that most of our audience will ever meet. You have how many on United Airlines? 2.6 million miles on United Airlines. And I know I've traveled with you some. By the way, for our audience, Ben Homan is one of the fastest walkers you'll ever meet. When we get in an airport, I'm like, I'm breaking into a jog sometimes trying to keep up with you. I can't believe how fast you can walk from gate to gate in an airport. But I look back, and for me personally, one of my stories where I saw that, and I want to ask you from one of yours, because you've been all over the world in some of the hardest places in the world. But one of mine was when I was in India, and I was preaching in this small village, and gosh, it breaks me emotionally just thinking about it. I mean, you're talking about people have nothing. And we went in there, and I preached a sermon, which was, I had prepared that, and then I sat down, and then I remember the funny part of the story is they started, the translator's talking, and he's not translating for me, and then he turns to me, he goes, "They want you to preach another one." And I was like, oh no. So I kind of look at my wife, because I'm like, I had the one prepared. I'm walking back up now going, I guess I'm just going to wing this next one. But what they said in that language, in that part of India, when they would pray, they would just say, Dhanyabad, 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 Dhanyabad. And they'd repeat that phrase over and over. And while they were singing, that phrase was coming. And all it meant was thank you. And it was this village where these people are, I mean, compared to us, they have nothing. And every time they would pray or sing, all over the congregations, just going, Dhanyabad, 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 Dhanyabad. Thank you, over and over again to God. That's what they were saying. So that was a place where I'm going, well, these people couldn't do anything for me. I put that in air quotes. Oh, they did a lot for me. They taught me gratitude in a way that I've never learned.
Right. Well, I might take this in an unlikely direction, but it is something that has happened recently. I was visiting a man closing in on 90 years of age at a retirement home here in the United States. He was a stroke victim. And so I was in the dining room of his retirement home, assisted living facility. And due to the stroke, he could not talk more than maybe a syllable every 10 minutes. He also could barely sip the soup. And so we sat there for 2 hours. And it was hard you couldn't have a conversation. And it was one of the most difficult meals that I ever had. But there was this opportunity for me to sit with this almost 90-year-old just to be with. Well, about a year ago, he passed away. And what I can tell you is that unbeknownst to me, unbeknownst to our ministry, millions of dollars have come to kingdom work as a result of his generosity, including to our ministry, but I can think of 4 other ministries, that this man who could not speak, who could barely eat, but he could take action and he could make a choice. We were talking about choice earlier. He could make a choice to make a difference. And he could have ended his life, sunsetted into anger or regret or sorrow or why me. But his sunset took him into how do I bless and accelerate the ministry of the word all around the world.
Wow.
So that, to me, that's really fresh.
Wow. Ben, how beautiful, right? And how that just makes God smile. Again, saying, I'm going to use the least of these. That's who I like to use. And here's a guy that can't even speak anymore and can barely eat, but I'm going to use him. And only eternity will tell the number of lives that have been impacted because of his gifts.
Exactly. And it came with no specific instructions. Do whatever you want to do to advance the ministry of the Word of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was not an onerous, like put my, do this, or this. No request for his name to be known.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just an honor to be able to see someone behind the scenes. Yet, as we were talking earlier, God sees him.
Yeah.
God saw him
Yeah.
in his inability to do anything. He could barely sip soup.
Yeah.
And here God is using his resources in, amazing, generous ways.
What a definition of legacy, right? Because like you said, he passed away about a year ago. And so he's no longer breathing in this life. And yet he's still having an impact. That's legacy, isn't it?
It is.
He's still having an impact.
Yeah, it is.
Well, this is a great transition for us to transition then slightly, again, with your theological, philosophical mind, I just want to hone in a little bit on that again. What are your thoughts about that? We talk about here a lot about the power and complexity of human choice because this podcast actually originated out of Joe Gagliano's story, No Gray Areas. There's a documentary about it. He masterminded the largest sports scandal that they know of in human history in '94, the ASU scandal. Walked away making millions of dollars, and both him and the point guard, Stevin Hedake Smith, are still, all these years later, facing the consequences of their choices. But we also know that there's a redemptive story with that. So that's really where this all originated, and that's where we talk about the fact that we as humans have the power that God created us with, the power of choice, but that's complex in that. What are your thoughts on that? This idea that we make our choices and eventually our choices make us.
It is a mystery how this all works together. Let me start there, because
theologians been arguing about that for 2,000 years.
Yeah, exactly. We've felled many trees printing books and debates and all of this. So I'm not going to be able to
split denominations over it.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to sort it out for people. I wake up today. The listeners wake up today. And we have choices to make. Mm-hmm. And so I would simply bring it into our own experience and realize that we can make, that we are conscious actors who make decisions. There can be, path A, B, C, D. Actually, there are quite a few choices out there. It's rarely maybe just a fork in the road. Mm-hmm. And I think for us to look at this element of choice as a blessing that God has delegated to us decisions who would not have to do it that way.
Yeah, that's true.
And so here we are not machines. We are not automatons. We are able to look at our situation. He's given us minds to think. And so that is a blessing, and it's an expression of trust and love on the part of our Creator. So I would start from the point of understanding, yes, today we can make choices. Yes, that's a blessing and a privilege. Mm-hmm. I enjoy going into grocery stores. The true confessions here.
Yeah.
And yet sometimes it's overwhelming to me because I'll go to the cereal aisle or the nut aisle.
It's almost too many choices, right?
There are so many choices. Do you want your cornflakes, flavored this or that?
Yeah.
And I do think that maybe one of the stresses that we experience in our modern Western society is that we have more choices than we know what to do with.
Man, that's a great point, Ben.
If we went back 200 years, and we were homesteading somewhere in the middle part of North America, and we were getting to the age of marriage. How many choices are out there?
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's true.
Yeah. So, you might have a conversation with your dad or mom and say, well, there's the Johnson girl, 2 miles down the road. She's about your age. Mm-hmm. And maybe there's the Smith gal. You're multiple. It's a multiple choice of maybe 4 people. Maybe there are more.
Yeah.
But today, technology has equipped us with these apps where
I could scroll through and have thousands of choices.
you can scroll through, and I think that we're burdened in this society by being able to have so many options that we get overwhelmed and we get stressed out.
Man, that's such a great point, because even, again, just because of our age, you and me, our age, and so for our younger listeners, I'm sure they've heard this, maybe they haven't, but even with TV, when we were growing up, you turned the TV on, you had three choices, right? ABC, CBS, and NBC. That was it. You had three choices. And which one of those three channels were you going to watch? And then at whatever it was, at midnight or whatever, it went off the air. You just had, like, if you got up at 12:30 and turned on the TV, it was just snow.
Yeah.
Shh, that sound.
Yeah. So it's obviously our experience is very different, but let's understand that, we're not going to change the fact that there are thousands and thousands of choices, but I think we need to be honest with ourselves that this creates some inherent stress and burden on
Great point.
our modern society. And so as we walk with people, I think we need to understand that this choice, yes, it's a blessing. Yes, it's a burden.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ben. Something for us to all think about a little bit. And I think even, my takeaway from what you're just saying is I probably want to reassess my life a little bit and maybe look to see if I can help limit some choices. Like that right there may just take a lot of stress off my life if I just did something like that.
It actually, I think it could.
That's why I only wear black shirts.
There we go.
I don't have to make a choice.
Yeah. So maybe the word that we might use or borrow is simplify. So if you're talking about, 98 choices, that's complicated. If we're talking about 5 choices, a lot simpler. And so this idea of how do we narrow the choices? What are the criteria that we use to narrow the choices down so that we're limiting ourselves? And in many ways, it would be a self-conscious decision. It would be a choice to limit our choices. And so that would be an intriguing thing to unpack and explore.
That is really intriguing, Ben. You just made me smile. It's a choice to limit our choices. Oh my, we got to do a podcast on that.
Okay.
We're going to do a whole special podcast on that at some point. Well, let me transition to this then. Again, our audience now recognizes you've spent a lot of your life
on airplanes.
On airplanes, yes.
I'm sorry.
But working with organizations that are focused on really in some way, in some form, helping the least, last, and lost, something that is close to your heart, which I think then is helpful for our audience to understand that when we talk about the power and complexity of human choice, we need to understand, if there's someone in our audience that's listening, you've never traveled to a third world country or developing country, you need to understand that the freedom of choice or the amount of choice that we get as humans is really limited sometimes just because of socioeconomic background, worldviews, cultural perspectives. For example, if you're a woman in some parts of the world, you have very little choice simply because of the gender you are. So you've seen much more than most people. How have you seen that to be true?
Well, let me think of a specific example. I sat with a 19-year-old young man in near Bogota, Colombia. He had, at age 13, been conscripted to fight with the drug cartel. They came into his village, killing people and requiring that the teenage boys, young men, would come fight with them in the jungles. He lost his education. He lost his family. He lost his connection to his village. And so peace was potentially coming to the nation. It's still complicated there, but he was now sitting with me and with others at age 19 in Bogota, Colombia, needing to take on a new identity because it was no longer safe to have the name that he had grown up with. And he had to surrender the notion of ever going back to his family or his village. just for survival.
Wow.
So the choices in front of this young man and many others, I think there are north of 5 million people just in Colombia who have been displaced because of decade after decade of narco-terrorism in that nation. And so we need to understand that again, the element of choice is a responsibility, and that we've been blessed with opportunities here in this country, but we need to understand that in many, many contexts, the choices have been really limited. And for him, he lost his education. So here he is, doesn't know how to do math, doesn't read or write. How do you start over?
Mm-hmm.
And so back to this notion of the choice, it is a burden, it is a blessing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not either or, it is both. And I think for us, we need to have compassion for all of these least and last people to understand that it cannot simply be, well, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and, get a life or make some positive choices. Let's understand that their context has seriously limited what choices there are. And then, of course, he was handed an automatic weapon when he was 13 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Not a video game where there are automatic weapons, but he was handed the real deal.
Mm-hmm.
He watched friends die. He watched village members die. And so reaching to somebody like that, and I would simply say, may we have compassion for the reality that he may not make always the best choices.
Yeah.
Somebody needs to walk with him in that choice-making process, patiently and understanding and listening. But that's a dramatic case. But I think that the reality is here in Western society, if we look at all of the people we come in contact with as individuals who have the various impairments that have prevented some of the best choices or stood in the way of some of the best choices, we ought to have a very highly tuned sense of empathy, care, and lack of judgment, not criticizing people for what we think might be bad choices.
Yeah.
So may we have patience.
Yeah. I loved your words: compassion, patience, empathy, all things that I think we need to have. And when we look at what do we have? Almost 7 billion people on our planet. Is that correct?
Something like that.
Something like that. When we look at the 7 billion people on our planet right now, the majority of them actually have limited choices. Like the story you told is a powerful story. The majority of them will have limited choices because they grew up in some kind of background like that, with something like that. So let me finish our interview with this before we wrap things up. How do you help people who maybe for the first time are going to travel to a place and see some of the things that you've seen? First of all, let me just say to our audience, I highly, highly recommend everyone should go to a developing country at least once in their life. It'll change the lens you look through for the rest of your life. But we know that a lot of people, when they go, they really come back and struggle because they see these things and they're like, for me, it was that was the thing for me. I came back and I'm like, why? Simply because of where I was born in this world, I have so many opportunities, and I had this almost this guilt complex. What would you say to people that maybe are going to go, or maybe are struggling with that, or maybe you're going to go for the first time and come back and wrestle with some of those things?
As we're wrapping up this episode, be sure to leave us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment on something you'll take away. All right, let's hop back into the remainder of the episode.
I would recommend beforehand reading history about where they're going. Not only the political history, but the sociological history. Go back centuries. There are PhD dissertations, there are academic journals there are outstanding things to learn about different places. Before going to the D.R. Congo, for instance, I read a book. I believe the name is King Leopold's Ghost, and it's a history of King Leopold of Belgium and the way that he took advantage of that country is an understatement. And then, of course, if we're just picking on the D.R. Congo, another must-read would be Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness, set in the D.R. Congo. So understand what has happened before. And so when we go in, we ought to go in with empathy and understanding of what the history is. History matters.
Yeah, it does.
And I would say not to be prescriptive ahead of time about what the Lord would be asking each person to do. I don't think that there would be a cookie cutter response. But if somebody is going to come back from, whether it's Guatemala or Bolivia or another place, to ask the Lord to show them what they can do. I think once we're back here, one of the very interesting things is that there are likely people from that country in the city that you're living in. And there are probably ways before your trip and then after your trip to find what I think the technical world, the diaspora, the people that have been dispersed all over the land, our own nation, because we have welcomed people from many lands, and they're facing issues here in this country, and there may be a way for one of our listeners to be a bridge to somebody from Senegal who is here in the United States of America and is trying to find their way.
Yeah.
And the fact that you have been in their country might blow them away.
Yeah.
I was walking through an airport last week, and I really appreciated that this particular airport had a map of the world showing the sister cities that city is connected with. And Pat knows more of the story. That was one of the things that we did at Food for the Hungry. Was we asked our civic leaders which places in the world is our municipality connected to. And at Food for the Hungry, we saw that as an opportunity to connect specifically with Chengdu, China, as a sister city of Phoenix, Arizona. But there are ways right where you're at, even when you come back, the Lord has placed people from other parts of the world, and they might be in, the Thai restaurant that you like to go to, or the Vietnamese restaurant, or wherever. But you will find people, and if you go in with an inquisitive heart and a willingness to see people, back to this notion of seeing people for who they are, noticing they're not just the kitchen help.
Yeah.
But they have dignity and they have identity. And it may mean going to that restaurant 12 or 13 times to be the regular, for some of the guards to be, some of the walls to be dropped, the guard being left down. Then you ask and see what the Lord might do. I was at a Chinese church some years ago, and I was just asking about some of the ministry that this church did. And they had Bible studies that started at 11 o'clock at night. And I wondered,
Yeah.
what's going on with that? And they said, well, that's when the Chinese restaurants close. So this church saw the Chinese restaurant workers, that was the only time that they would have the opportunity to study the Bible.
Wow.
And so I love that creativity. And in this one of these Bible studies at 11 o'clock at night, there was a young man and a young woman who started liking each other, and they ended up getting married. And the wedding took place at midnight because that's when they had time off. And the elder who was telling me this story said, we didn't know, do we do it on such and such a day or the other day?
Because it's right.
It's right on midnight.
Yeah.
You're straddling these 2 days. And they were sort of like, which day do you want to be your anniversary?
Yeah.
So
they could say their wedding went on for 2 days.
Yeah, exactly. It was a festival, a feast. So there are places to connect with the diaspora when you get back. And I think also we need to be patient with some of the people that didn't go on the trip, that they may not be able to get or understand the transformative power of being in a distant place and what you went through. So there needs to be some caution there. In our community, we live up in the state of Montana. We had a community forum with people from religious backgrounds and also secular backgrounds, a panel about the conflict in Ukraine. And so showing up, my wife and I, we attended that in a big auditorium of a high school. So I would say to people, go to places that are outside of the church and show up, and then go up and talk to people afterwards.
Yes.
And there are going to be amazing opportunities. So wherever you are, even though you don't have to get on a plane to have an international opportunity to connect and make an impact.
You don't have to cross a border to cross a culture.
Yes.
Right. Well, Ben, how would someone get in contact with your organization? You guys are doing some great things. I want to open that up to you, just letting them to know if they wanted to contact you guys or get a hold of you.
Right. A couple of things. First of all, obviously our website, that's langham.org, langham.org. It's an obscure name. We know that. It's named after a street in London from whence our ministry emerged.
Yeah.
So langham.org. The other thing that people can do, wherever you get your podcasts, you go in there and you type in On Mission with Chris Wright. On Mission with Chris Wright. And Chris is my Irish colleague, lives in central London, and he has lengthy 45 to 50-minute interviews with theological and religious leaders from all over the world.
Yeah.
So if you want to listen to a deep conversation with a Palestinian Christian, a Filipino Christian, a Bolivian Christian, go to On Mission with Chris Wright.
One of the intellectual giants, theological giants, we might say, in our day. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, even last year, one of Christianity Today's top book awards went to Chris.
Yeah.
You know, I joke with him, he's a good friend, that he has a serious problem because he cannot stop writing books.
Yes.
Yeah, so he needs to be in some
And they're not easy books to read. Again, like the one that you mentioned On Mission, it's about this thick for the people that are watching, and you don't just breeze through it. You have to like reread a sentence every once in a while and go like, wait, what did he just say?
Yeah. And Chris is his PhD is in ethics, Old Testament ethics for the people of God, and but his ability to integrate the whole of Scripture is just remarkable. He's a trusted voice.
Man, if he's ever in town, we'd love to have him on.
Okay.
Just keep that in mind. I know you're friends with him, and if he's in the Phoenix area, we'd love to. We do remote podcasts, but there's something about sitting across the table that I just love.
Yeah.
It's just different. Well, Ben, this is where we do this, something that's just kind of fun at the end of the podcast, Two Truths and a Lie. And it's ironic because it's no gray areas and I'm going to ask you to lie to me, but it's fun for the audience because they've heard you here for 45 minutes to an hour. And then you're going to give just 3 statements. 2 of them will be true, 1 will be a lie, and we're going to try to guess which one the lie is.
Okay. statement number one.
Okay.
My father attended 2 Academy Award Oscar ceremonies.
Okay.
Number 2, I appeared in a cameo role in a prize-winning Chinese film.
Okay.
Number 3, my mother went to school with Bob Denver of Gilligan's Island.
Yeah. Oh, man. You should play poker because I'm trying to give a tell. I'm looking at you while you're saying those 3, trying to get some kind of tell with your face, and you're not giving anything away. You don't even have sunglasses on, Ben.
That's right.
Your eyes aren't giving anything
But
away.
you told me ahead of time to come up with these statements, and I thought, well, I'm going to stay in the entertainment realm.
Yeah.
So they're all in the entertainment realm.
I'm just guessing. I don't even have any leads on this one. I'm going to just guess that you did a cameo because you've traveled so much. You spent quite a bit of time in China. So I'm going to say that one's true. You did a cameo role in a Chinese film.
That is true. I played a journalist in a Chinese film. The English translation is that the film was called Juvenile Delinquents.
Yeah.
And it won a prize in China. And it actually gave me a fascinating opportunity to visit a juvenile detention facility
in China,
in Shanghai.
So when we post this, I don't know when this is going to drop our podcast, but can we add a descriptor? Chinese movie star Ben Homan. Do you think we can do that?
That might be an exaggeration.
Okay. My next one, I think I'm going to guess that because you're from Southern California, so I think I'm going to guess that your dad actually attended 2 Academy Awards ceremonies. That's true.
That is true. Well done.
I did it.
Well done. He was a lighting technician.
Okay.
But he had to rent a tuxedo.
Yeah.
And to show up to the Academy Awards and help them with their lighting. And,
how amazing. What a great
he was Local 33, the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, but he attended 2 Oscars.
Wow.
On the technical side.
So your mom did not know Mr. Gilligan. We might call him Bob Denver.
But there's a technical.
I knew there had to be something.
There had to be a technical. She did go to school with Alan Hale Jr., the skipper on Gilligan's Island. But not Bob Denver.
Yeah. Okay. That was good. All right. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it. Great to see you again, my friend.
Great to see you.
Coming on 2 decades of friendship. So
let's keep it going.
Yeah. Thank you.
As we close this episode, we hope you've been encouraged to embrace the paradox of choice with a new perspective. Make sure to like, subscribe, and if you love this episode, would you please leave us a 5-star review? Thanks for joining us today on the No Gray Areas podcast. We'll see you next time.